Isabelle Falconi. I'm Geneva Press Club Director. We're very glad to welcome DBIO, Down by Anti-Occupation Coalition, and Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies here at the Geneva Press Club for this press conference dedicated to DBIO 2024 report. This report launch is a side event of the 13th UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva. DBIO is a coalition of 25 civil society organizations coming together to investigate and expose the financial relationships between businesses involved in the illegal Israeli settlements enterprise in the occupied Palestinian territory and European financial institution. Welcome to those following us online as well. And I'm very happy to give the floor to the person who will be your moderator today. This is Eva Garitze from PAX. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much also for hosting us here. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here and in Geneva and online. Isabelle already introduced us, of course. We're a coalition of 25 European and Palestinian NGOs and trade unions investigating the financial relationships between European financial institutions and companies that are involved with the illegal Israeli settlement enterprise. The coalition exists since 2021 and today publishes its 4th report. So in the very few minutes I have now, I can of course not do justice to the totality of the horrors unfolding at the moment in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza. Since October last year, Israel has killed almost 44,000 Palestinians, wounded over 100,000 Palestinians, displaced almost 90% of the population of Gaza, and has caused enormous destruction in an onslaught that, according to numerous experts, amounts to genocide. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk has warned last month that Gaza's darkest moment is unfolding, and adding that the Israeli government's current policies and practices in northern Gaza risk emptying the area of all Palestinians. Last week, the ICC issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, on the West Bank, we'll hear more about that also from our second speaker. Israeli violence against and repression of Palestinians has massively increased. The Israeli government has also increased the construction and expansion of settlements. And in May 2024, the government took various steps to transfer powers in the West Bank to civilian officials, thereby consolidating the de jure annexation of the occupied territory. On the 19th of July this year, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion concluding that the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank is unlawful and needs to be ended as rapidly as possible. This will no doubt also be discussed extensively. It is in this context that we publish today's report, or this year's report, and it is in this context. It is also this context which places ever more urgency on corporate actors to act and stop contributing to Israel's occupation and atrocity crimes in the OPT. I would first like to give the word to my colleague Andrew Preston of Norwegian People's Aid. He will present the report and the results of this year's research and recommendations. And then we'll have an excellent panel of speakers. Rania Mahdi, Senior Legal Advisor at human rights organization Law for Palestine. Dr. Tara van Ho, Business and Human Rights Expert and Senior Lecturer at Essex Law School. Then we'll have Francesca Albanese joining online, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories. And last, we were very happy to have Jens Skanke-Prestus. He works as an analyst for the Responsible Investment Team at KLP Asset Management, which is the largest private pension fund in Norway. Time is quite short, so I would like to ask the speakers to really limit their presentations to 5-6 minutes, also to leave room for questions from the audience. The audience, I would like to ask to keep your questions short and to the point. So yeah, we're live streaming this event, but I will prioritize questions coming from the audience here. If there's time left, we will see if there's questions from the online participants. So, Andrew.
Thank you, Eva. So the purpose of the Don't Buy Into Occupation Coalition is to look into the financial relationships between European financial institutions and the illegal settlement enterprise on occupied Palestinian territory. This is our fourth report since 2021, and with the help of Profundo, a Netherlands-based independent research organisation, and financial data providers, we have basically come to the following findings. Between January 2021 and August 2024, 822 European financial institutions have had financial relationships with 58 companies that we believe are complicit in the illegal settlement enterprise in occupied Palestinian territory. So these 58 companies, some of them are household names like Airbnb, TripAdvisor, which many of us probably used without even thinking about it. There are companies that are involved in reinforcing the annexation of Palestinian territory through infrastructure development, such as Alstom and CAF. They are service providers and retailers like Bezek, Carlsberg and Carrefour. They are banks that provide financing to new and existing settlements and housing loans to illegal settlers. And there are companies that are involved in direct violations of international humanitarian law, such as Heidelberg Materials in Germany, which has now I'm thinking just in Norwegian, a quarry in the West Bank, which is exploiting Palestinian natural resources. In total, in money terms, the lending, credits, shareholdings and bond holdings by these financial institutions amount to almost $400 billion. And we're not saying, of course, that all this capital is going towards the settlement enterprise. Of course it is not. But it just gives you an idea of the scale of involvement in companies who should be doing a better job with their due diligence. So what do these figures tell us? The numbers of financial institutions and the scale of the investments, holdings, lending to the 58 companies I mentioned have actually increased since we began giving out the report. So it's a negative trend. And the heightened due diligence that we've been talking about down the road at the UN Forum, the heightened due diligence, which the international guidelines for responsible business say companies should be doing in conflict areas, is not being done in anything like the scale that is required, or is not leading to the expected outcomes. And the critical element in this heightened due diligence is understanding the impacts of business involvement on the context, on the conflict, not just the direct impacts on the people, but the whole context. And this is either not fully understood, or maybe a measure of investors not being sufficiently, companies and investors not being sufficiently engaged in the heightened due diligence agenda. It also raises concerns about the quality of ESG data and to what extent ESG data captures all human rights risks. And it perhaps indicates, this is not something we go into in the report, but it perhaps indicates also that companies and investors maybe have an overly generous approach to how long companies should be given to sort out these, to address these issues. So we focus a lot in the report on what is not being done, but it would be amiss of us not to mention the financial institutions who are doing a conscientious and long-term job to address the dilemmas involved in working in conflict areas. And some of those institutions are with us today, including KLP. And we give other examples in the report. So we make 23 different recommendations in the report. I'm not going to go into all of them now, but the most urgent of these is this imperative of heightened due diligence. And in our view, European financial institutions should be urgently reassessing their approach to portfolio companies involved in the illegal occupation. And as many of you will know, in July this year, the International Court of Justice said very clearly that the occupation of Palestinian territory in its entirety is illegal. So it's not just a question of the settlements. Now the top lawyers in the world are saying the whole occupation is illegal and should end as soon as possible. And that brings with it responsibilities. So urgently reassessing their approach, urgently because the issues, the negative impacts are persistent and well known. We've been talking about this for decades. Urgently because of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice opinion, and urgently because of the situation on the ground that was mentioned at the beginning, both in Gaza, which is still considered occupied territory by the international community, and in the West Bank, where we are seeing a disturbing deterioration. This all warrants a robust response from companies and from investors. So our staff, and I speak for my own organization, but our staff on the ground in Palestine and our Palestinian partners on the ground feel largely abandoned by the international community. They see double standards in the way that we in Europe deal with different conflicts. But the business community can actually do their bit to support the rules-based international order, even if our governments are not doing a good job of that. And while some financial actors may feel that that is not their responsibility, then at the very least respect the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines, which we've all helped to develop together, and heed the advice of the world's highest court. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I would like to give the word to Rania Mahdi to reflect on the current context at the West Bank and recent legal developments.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you for including me in this panel, although I'm not one of the people who helped to really submit this report. And really, this is something very important. The question of businesses with the settlement or based on the occupied territories or businesses with the Israeli government as well, it's a subject in which since long time we were talking about, even before the creation of BDS, before we signed the chart, etc. Because we understand that one day this occupation should end, and with the finance help from, unfortunately, the international community and countries, etc., and businesses, it will continue. And this is the reason why it lasts more than, let's say, 75 years. In fact, 5 minutes is not easy to speak about the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, but I will try to bring some issues or some numbers. So I'm sorry if I'm reading them because I don't know them by heart. So the Palestinian struggle to live with dignity under the Israeli occupation facing coercive practices since more than 75 years. And in fact, because this is what they want me to speak since the last year, not before, but it linked of what's happened, since the last, let's say, 57 years or 75 years, it depends. In fact, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, from 7 October, I have to give you some numbers which is very important. You can understand that 790 structures were demolished. And when the Israelis say structure, which means, some places where the Bedouins used to live. And by the way, to remind you, the Bedouins hold Israeli nationality. Yeah. And 1,093 of these people were displaced. No building permit, land confiscation. Forced demolitions, Palestinian homes displaced more than 4,000. Among them, 1,375 children. You can imagine when children, they are unable to go to school or to live a normal life. According to two organizations, B'Tselem, which is Israeli organization, and Ad-Damir, 9,500 Palestinians in detention for security reasons. We don't understand what means security. Among them, 3,660 in administrative detention. So until now, there is no court. They don't know why they are arrested or in detain. 80 female prisoners. And by the way, it's the first time since we follow the issue of prisoners that some female Palestinians, they confess that they were a subject of really sexual harassment. Because for the society, for the Palestinian society, we never speak about this issue, even men or women. But we understand because we met some of them in private way, and they were really in a very bad situation because the society doesn't accept this. 205 minor prisoners, in which they are under the age of 18. 561 life sentences. You can imagine when people really just, this is their life. And the other important issue, because this is what I have to bring, which is the last two bills, submitted by the Knesset in the 28th of October, which is banning the operation of UNRWA in the OPT and East Jerusalem. So you can imagine the role of UNRWA when it comes to education and the healthcare. What will become these people? They are more than millions. We are not talking about tens or thousands. I don't know what will happen with the teachers, with the staff, the workers in the healthcare, etc. And they don't have the possibility, of course, to go to these private schools, either under the Israeli, let's say, control, or the other schools, because it's really very much expensive. With this bill, the Israeli violated the UN Security General Convention, which was in 1946, 17 September, if I still remember. The other bill, which is very important, I think everybody follow the violence of the settlers. So the other bill, which is giving immunity to settlers from detention without trial. The UN report in 16 October 2024 calls Israel must stop violent settler attacks on Palestinian farmers and stealing their olive harvest. You can imagine when you prepare the whole year to have the harvest to sell, to live in dignity, and then it's stolen. Because that's, the settlers, they are keeping really attacking the farmers. And here I want to bring one issue. You can imagine when after they built the wall, which is called the separation wall, we call it apartheid wall, the people were unable to have access to their land. So you understand, it's the only origin where they could really have money. It's really like stolen. It became very, very complicated for them to have access to their land. The special rapporteur of the right to food, in his last report, he is the one who brings this issue publicly. So this is why we said the issue doesn't start 7 or 8 October, but unfortunately the international community kept silent. And if I want to bring Gaza briefly, because I think the others have to speak about it, the displaced Gazans are living in a tragedy, severe shortages of food, clothing, tents, protect them from the harsh winter, no safe shelter from cold weather, schools bombed, hospitals demolished. And here I have to remind you that there is 15 wars against the Gazans since Gaza was forced to be separated from the West Bank. And here I have to remind you just the last 5 ones, 2008, and we have a resolution, Commission of Inquiry. 2012, a resolution, Commission of Inquiry. 2014, 2018, 2021. I'm sorry, this is real. And we have a lot of resolutions. We have reports of the Commission of Inquiry, and unfortunately, nothing changed. So this is why it's a moment now to start together to work to end this illegal occupation. It's a shame for humanity. It's a shame for law, because I can't imagine that the whole system in which was built after the Second World War will be demolished now just to protect this illegal really system of occupation, colonization, and system of apartheid. We are humans, and we should be treated as humans. No international law for Israeli and other for us. Do they have the right to kill, and we have the right to die? So, this is why Israel should be held accountable. Otherwise, I don't know how we will be in the future able to answer the questions of students. Last week in Geneva Academy, somebody asked me, Madam, we should stop learning international law. I was shocked. I told them no. Many countries, the colonization system has ended, and in that time, we didn't see all these videos or the information that we saw now. And I gave them the example of Algeria, in which 130 years was under colonization, and it was end. We didn't see the same issues that what we watch now of what's happening in Gaza. When it comes to the ICJ ruling, it's a historic for humanity. This has given me more and more, really, let's say, force to continue the fight, because I was one of the, let's say, people who work with the ICC in order to bring a case against some really Israeli well-known personalities. Yeah. It's not just in last year, but it was in 2016 against, the subject was the forced displacement, because this is something very important. So the ruling was very important. I'm sorry, I will go so quickly. So, in fact, when it comes to the ruling, so the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory is illegal under international law. The Israeli must end its 57-year-old occupation as rapidly as possible. Israeli must also take measures to improve the humanitarian situation of civilians, not just in Gaza, but as well in the OPT. And as well, the states and the UN NGOs have responsibility to refrain from aiding the occupation or recognizing Israeli presence in the OPT. Clear obligation for the UN states, distinguishing between Israel and the OPT, not supporting unlawful acts and unlawful situation, and ensuring Israeli compliance with international humanitarian law or the law of war. On the 18th September, only 13 EU member states unfortunately voted in favor of the UN General Assembly, reflecting the ICJ advisory opinion. The court stated the Israeli unlawful policies and practices violate the rights of the Palestinians to self-determination for a long period. The ICJ ruling devotes 49 paragraphs to discussing the Israeli discriminatory legislation in the OPT, the Israeli residency permit policy, severe restrictions on Palestinian movement, property demolitions as permit measure. Do you want me to stop then with the questions?
Well, maybe if you can wrap it up, that would be great. I understand it's very important.
Yeah, I have just one really good positive news, so I have to announce it, which is really, I'm so happy that a major German media, the good news, a legal complaint was filed under the German due diligence law to hold the major German media, Axel Springer, accountable for their economic activity in the illegal occupied West Bank. The company contributes for land grabbing and human rights abuses in the OPT, and I hope many cases will be to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rania, and I very much realize that 5 minutes is way too short. But thank you for very clearly stating the facts. Tara, if we can go to you. Maybe if you can reflect a bit more on business responsibilities in conflict-affected areas, and may I ask the following speakers to keep it a bit short, just to leave room for questions.
Thank you, Eva. So under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are currently the most authoritative statement on businesses' responsibility for human rights under international law, all businesses are expected to do human rights at all times, but in situations of conflict or occupation, businesses are supposed to do heightened human rights due diligence. And what this means is that they're not just assessing their impact on human rights directly, but also quite indirectly via how they impact on the conflict dynamics. Where a business causes or contributes to a harm, they're expected to stop their harmful conduct, terminate relationships that are necessary to stop that harmful conduct, and to provide remedies and reparations for the harms that they have caused. If a business is only directly linked to a harm, they're expected to use their leverage to effect change. Many conflicts raise complex questions about whether this means that a business should stay or should go. This is not one of those conflicts. As Rania has explained, the International Court of Justice has been very clear. This is an unlawful occupation. It involves widespread and systematic human rights violations. It involves war crimes, and it involves a legal system akin to apartheid in East Jerusalem. Those are policies that have been adopted by the State of Israel through multiple successive governments. As Rania also said, this is not a post-7 of October issue. The ICJ actually explicitly excluded the facts related to Israel's conduct post-7th of October from its consideration in its occupation decision. Instead, those issues will be addressed in a separate case by the ICJ under the Genocide Convention, a case brought by South Africa against Israel. So these systems are policies and choices that the Israeli government has made repeatedly and that they continue to make. That means that businesses that are operating in the settlements are operating in complicity with war crimes. That means they have a responsibility to divest. They have to stop the relationships that give rise to the harmful conduct. Now, I should be clear here that there's a difference between BDS, which is a social and political movement. It is a political choice and a moral choice as to whether or not you participate in BDS. But the obligation to divest is not a political or moral choice. It's a legal obligation. You are obligated to divest where you are complicit in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and apartheid. That means that businesses, European businesses, have that obligation, and that they owe reparations to Palestinians for the harms that they have already caused and contributed to. Similarly, European states are obliged to terminate trade and economic agreements that normalize the occupation. The ICJ was quite clear about that in the occupation advisory opinion. Currently, they're failing to do that, but that doesn't mean that will stay as a political norm. So it's not just that there is a legal expectation on businesses to terminate the relationship, but it's also the financially prudent thing to do. There is a material risk to staying in the occupied territories.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you. Then our last, Francesca Albanese. Of course. Is Francesca online? She's not online? Okay, that's fine. We'll continue with Jens. Jens, you work for KLP. KLP recently divested from one of the complicit companies, Caterpillar, following also quite a large swath of divestments earlier. Would you be able to reflect on KLP's approach to these investments and the recent divestment decisions?
Definitely, happy to. And first of all, just wanted to obviously say thank you to Eva and Andrew and the wider DBIO coalition for inviting me here to speak about this important topic. And I first wanted to maybe highlight 2 points about KLP as a company, as an investor, and then one about our approach before I go into some of our recent divestments, because I think that's important context in this regard. And the first point, as Eva mentioned, is that we're a pension fund. So we're owned by Norwegian municipalities, and we manage retirement funds for thousands of teachers, healthcare workers, etc. In other words, not people who just want to make a quick buck. So for us, the need to think long term is key to the way that we invest. The second is that the need to invest for us responsibly is enshrined in our values, really. It's one of our core values. And the reason for that is not just because we think it's the right thing to do in our obligation as a large financial institution who can create a difference in the world and on this topic too, but also because if we don't, the only way that we can provide stable long-term returns for our retirement funds customers is if we invest in companies with responsible business conduct. And that's what Tara also said just now, that there is a material risk, that there is a huge financial loss if we don't do that, and that's a very material risk. That said, we don't want to divest from companies. That's not our end goal. We much prefer to do active ownership of companies through voting at AGMs and through dialogue with companies, with other investors, and with NGOs like PACS and Norwegian People's Aid and other NGOs who really are truly, for us, really great partners when it comes to the information gathering process, etc. We need to see that we need to have sufficient evidence of complete wrongdoing by a company that we're invested in, or knowledge of wrongdoing and failure to do anything about it, combined with, through engagement, that we don't really see that any of these companies are listening to us and trying to change their behavior. If those two criteria are fulfilled, then we feel it's our obligation to divest from that company. and that's perhaps a good segue into the topic today and some of our recent divestments. So the war in Gaza and the occupation and illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian territories has always been a key priority and theme for us at KLP. And I wanted to maybe highlight a few examples, maybe 3 examples of companies that we've divested from. So you alluded to that, Eva, just now. And back in 2021, we divested from 16 companies because of their links to Israel's illegal occupation settlements in occupied Palestinian territories. And they included, as Andrew just mentioned too, that included French engineering company Alstom. It was Dutch telecoms firm Altice, US technology company Motorola, and a number of financial institutions, including several Israeli banks. And the reason why, or the key criteria that we looked at there, which is also a point that is mentioned in the new DBIO report too, is the point about dual use. So these companies typically provide civilian goods and services, but in this case it was pretty clear to us that they were contributing and helping Israel both maintain but also expand their illegal settlement. So you had an engineering companies building transportation infrastructure, obviously needed for a settlement. You had financial services companies providing loans for new homes in these settlements. You had technology companies providing technology that is used for surveillance of innocent civilian Palestinians. So there was a clear dual-use component there, and through dialogue with these companies, mounting evidence collected by the DBIO coalition and others, it was quite clear that they weren't going to change their behavior. They weren't going to conduct any more enhanced due diligence on their customers, on their Israeli customers or European or American customers. So for us then it was pretty clear that we didn't really have much of a choice but to divest. And the more recent example of Caterpillar, which we divested from this summer, which is the most recent Israel-related divestment we made. In that case, it was also the dual-use factor, so it was partly because we knew that their bulldozers, for instance, were being used to demolish homes of innocent Palestinians. But you also had the added factor of mounting evidence suggesting that Caterpillar equipment, bulldozers, were being used in the war in Gaza, for instance, by the IDF mounting weapons on them and using them in combat. And obviously that's another very critical and concerning piece of evidence for us. And when we then, obviously, we tried to engage with Caterpillar and we didn't really see any clear indication that they were going to change their practices. And it should be noted that even though Caterpillar weren't selling their equipment directly to the IDF, there was pretty clear evidence of how their equipment ultimately were being used by the IDF, even if they were selling to a distributor in Israel. And so when they didn't even give an indication that they wanted to conduct any enhanced due diligence on their customers, it was pretty clear, and ultimately there too it was a company that we had to divest from. And maybe as a final example, which I can't provide too much information on because it's still an ongoing process for us, but as you might remember from this summer, the UN had a press release urging global defense companies to stop selling weapons and components and parts to Israel. On that list, we've already divested from most of them, but there are a few left that we're now conducting our own enhanced due diligence on, that we're trying to engage with, and we're seeing if those are companies that we should still remain invested in, or if those are companies that we should exclude from our portfolios too. And that's just also to highlight the importance of for us to have the resources from entities like the DBIO coalition who can pinpoint the most troublesome companies, as well as the UN that can also pinpoint the most troubled companies, because there's limited resources for us too in terms of going after every single company. We need to focus our resources on the ones that really matter and where we can make a difference by trying to put that on the agenda and divest from those most troublesome companies. So I think I'll stop there and then, yeah.
Thank you so much. Francesca Albanese is not online yet, so we'll just open the floor for questions to these 4 speakers. I have a question here at the front.
Thank you very much. Alfred Desaias, former UN independent expert on international order and member of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute. Bearing in mind, a question to all four, bearing in mind that the ICC has jurisdiction over persons, why don't NGOs like yours name the business executives most involved in financing the illegal settlements, those selling weapons to the state of Israel, businesses, of course, and individuals are complicit in genocide. And we at the Geneva International Peace Research Institute presented a 30-page legal brief against officials of the European Union, including Ursula von der Leyen, for providing military, political, economic, diplomatic, and propagandistic support to Israel. I mean, the case, of course, was received and acknowledged, but of course there's been no progress on it. Now, after the indictments against Netanyahu and Diane, maybe, Gallant, maybe, that might have a possibility of advancing. And I would ask you, from your NGO, would you endorse the legal brief that we submitted on the 25th of May this year? I can make it available to you. If you give me your emails, I will send you the full text. And beyond that...
can we maybe keep it to that?
Okay, one last question with regard to a letter sent by former Undersecretary General Pino Arlacchi to the General Assembly and to Antonio Guterres. It's a petition to the General Assembly to apply the same principle that was applied against apartheid South Africa in 1974 by withdrawing accreditation of the diplomatic representation of Israel. That would take the vote away of Israel. It's not the same as expelling them, because expelling under Article 6 would be vetoed by the United States in the Security Council. But it is within the remit of the General Assembly to take the vote away from Israel. And symbolically, that would have an important impact in the momentum that is growing in order to isolate Israel. So my question, would you endorse these two initiatives? Thank you.
We can also take more questions first. What do you prefer? Let's take 2 more questions.
You sure? Okay. So a question here, and then I think in the front.
My question is, are you aware of the armaments that are being used to bomb Gaza? The MK-84 is a 900-kilo bomb with 740 kilos of uranium in it. The U.S. delivered 10,000 of these before October, and Reuters reported in June that an additional 4,000 were delivered, and we have irrefutable proof of this in the photographs, the peculiar explosions. Are you aware of this and taking this into account? Gaza is irremediably contaminated, but as time goes on, every time the wind shifts from the south, all of Israel also. Are you aware of this, and why not?
Do you want to take another question?
Yeah, let's take one more question. There in the back.
Okay, I'll give you the microphone.
Hey, good afternoon. Emma Farge from Reuters News. Andrew, you described a negative trend over time. Could you compare this year's findings with previous findings, please? And also tell us a bit more about how you calculated this figure of nearly 400 billion. Thank you.
Tara, I saw that you would like to respond to the first.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
If you don't mind. So on the ICC jurisdiction question, businesses have been named. I worked with a Palestinian NGO in 2015, and we sent business names to the ICC to the Office of the Prosecutor. And that was over the settlements. That was long before Gaza, long before the current iteration of Gaza. We've been waiting for those indictments ever since. The fact that we have indictments now over Gaza is significant. Now it's time for the ICC to expand that and to take seriously the war crimes that are taking place as part of the occupation. So the other questions were more political in nature in terms of endorsements of things. So I'm going to stay away from that.
Rania, would you like to reflect?
First of all, it's a very good question. In fact, okay, I was three times in the ICC, but we didn't think about it. Honestly speaking, when it comes to businesses, we were really looking to bring, let's say, approval of what's happened, you know, like the decision makers of killing people, etc. So we didn't really take this in consideration. But I totally agree with you. It should be really linked together. Here I want to mention something because one of the questions when it comes to the forced displaced of the Palestinians, in fact, this issue, if it was taken in consideration in 1948, you know, when more than 400 villages have been destroyed and people were obliged to leave. This is why I bring the UNRWA in my question. So the UNRWA role was just for 4 years, you know, to finish their job, to bring back the Palestinians to their homes and villages in which they were obliged to leave. Either there is some massacres or they were afraid. And in that time, you know, they are mostly farmers, you know. And this is what my grandfather told me, because I'm originally from Jaffa, but we were refugees in Ramallah. Can you imagine? I'm a Palestinian refugee in my own land. I'm not a refugee in Europe. So the issue of Gaza, in which I remember a report, I'm sure you know about it, in 2022, when they discovered there is a lot of really gas and petrol near the shore. So I think it was something planned. If it wasn't in 7 October, it could be really later. So this is why I told people the issue is not just 7 October. There is plans, you know. And by the way, I read that one Israeli official, they declare that now they will start to build a new settlement inside Gaza. So you understand the project. This is why I totally agree with you. We have to link both together, you know, the two issues together. It's not just to follow the officials, but as well businesses should be included. Maybe in the future, when we found some NGOs have discouraged the same like them, then we can go more forward. Thank you.
Andrew, if you want to respond to the...
Yeah, okay, there's quite a few questions directed at NGOs in general. So if I begin with the legal question, as Tara was indicating, there are cases beginning to come on Palestine related to individuals. But I think the honest answer to you is why has it not happened more is because NGOs are not really rigged properly yet to do that type of work. We have a number of people in this room who have been very closely involved in the Lundin case in the South Sudan, and they'll be able to tell you when we're finished just how much work that has taken by a large number of NGOs to get that to court, to follow the court case now in Stockholm, and to hopefully see it through to its rightful end. It's a huge job, and we are often funded by donors with very specific mandates, and this type of work often comes, this is sort of in addition. So that maybe is the reason why we haven't seen more of those cases, but cases are coming, and as I think the lady said in the forum this morning, in the dialogue group on conflict areas, we need to, as a community, we need to keep track of case law and see where it's taking us. On the question of weapons, yes, we are very aware of the weapons being used. And indeed, a large number of members of the coalition produced a report specifically on investments in weapons companies earlier this year. And the reason why we have, this coalition began with a focus primarily on the illegal settlement enterprise. That's where we began our work. But now that we have this ICJ ruling from July, we will expand our focus next year. And not least because of everything, all the horrors going on in Gaza, there will be much more focus on the weapons companies. But we are focused on that in different ways. And then the question about the negative trends. Again, I just want to underline that the numbers in terms of money, this is the total amount of shareholdings, bond holdings, and lending to these companies. So we can't say that all this money is underwriting the occupation, because that would be incorrect. But how have we got to those figures? We have basically, using Thomson Reuters and different financial data providers, we have gone through the companies which we believe are complicit in the occupation and matched those or screened those companies against all European financial institutions. So it's really just a matter of digging through the numbers. And then we put that together, and in this year's report we have a figure of $211 billion on lending and underwriting, and $182 billion in shares and bonds, which is roughly 400 billion in total. But in the previous years, okay, if we take number of financial institutions, in 2022 we counted 725. In 2023, 776, and this year 822. And on the credit and underwriting side, we began with, in 2022 we had 171 billion. It dipped a little in 2023, and then it's gone up again to 2011. And on the shares and bonds, it's basically 115 billion in 2022, up to 144 billion in 2023, and then up to 182 billion in 2024. So, yeah.
Tara, would you like to...
Andrew, can I just clarify, that means that we have seen a significant increase in both the number of financial institutions operating in Israel and supporting the occupation, as well as just full monetary value that's invested by European institutions in the occupation?
That's the clear indication, but we have to, every time we look at these figures, you have to remember that sometimes there are new companies coming into focus. So companies which weren't previously complicit in the occupation have become complicit during the course of the last 12 months, which may mean that additional financial institutions also come into the spotlight. So there's sort of different variables here that we have to be aware of, but the indication is that things are going in the wrong way.
Pretty shocking when there's a genocide case before the ICJ.
I agree. More questions?
There was the question about the armament. Does anyone want to answer?
Was that for Jens or for the group as a whole? I assumed it was for you, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. No. I can answer if, yeah. So obviously, it's a great question. Obviously, that's linked to what I was highlighting earlier about the need to look closer for us as investors at defense companies. There's a reason why we've already, us at KLP, divested from most of the companies that were listed in the UN press conference press release this summer. Or was that not the question you had?
See, what I'm talking about is a whole different dimension. You're talking about the companies that manufacture these weapons. I'm talking about the use of them. You have 14,000 times 740 tons of uranium. And it's Fallujah writ large. If you know Fallujah, what happened there? It's uninhabitable. And so you're talking about disinvestment, investment, and so on, activity. There should be no more activity. It's irremediably contaminated. And we've been tracking this. You can track this on the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration website. Track the winds where they're carrying the particles. They've turned up in Aldermaston, outside of London, in the air monitoring stations there. But they're uranium particles. They're good for 22 billion years. But the United States still has not acknowledged that this radioactivity is dangerous. And so you can imagine Israel saying the same thing.
Thank you very much for that very relevant addition. Yeah, if you want to.
Okay, Rania.
I have to add something maybe we missed to mention, which is I hope one day we can follow or we can have a law which prevent people who have double nationality and they serve the army. You know, they are Europeans and they profit. They have also Israeli passport. They go, they serve the army because we were working with the EU since 2018. And I think just France will accept really to have a part of the law in their constitution that it's forbidden for the French citizen to serve in the army, even if they have in the Israeli army or other army, of course, even if they have the double nationality. So I think this is very important issue also to keep it in consideration for the future.
Yes, of course, very clear that
we have another question.
A lot is involved with what is happening. Question here in the front.
Yeah, Nina Larson with AFP. I had two questions actually. I was wondering if you could say how your list of companies compares to the database that's been produced by the CHR, and what kind of cooperation you've had with them, and sort of in that context, the deterioration you've seen, since the UN started focusing on that, if you have any thoughts around that. And finally, if there's anyone who has any thoughts on Finance Minister Smotrich's comments today, doubling down on the need to annex, or he wants to occupy to annex the West Bank, and then also saying that Gaza you can have the population there within the next 2 years. If you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Can we take another question here in the front and then in the back? Yeah.
So we're talking about divestment, but we're not saying where that money is going. So I think it's a good thing not to fund the Israeli occupation. But what about funding the Palestinian right of resistance? Is there any way that's taken into account? So we are not just acting negatively, but actually trying to help positively by bringing money to the people who are trying to resist and live there.
Thank you. In the back.
There's been a lot of conversation at the UN Forum about the important role of ESG data providers and ratings agencies, and I was just curious if you could discuss their role in this conflict.
Who could I give the word to the question about the UN database and the comparison with the companies in our report? Andrew?
Yeah, I can take the first question, the first two questions. So just on the question about Smotrich, the problem here is that for too long, the occupation has been allowed to continue without any cost whatsoever to the Israeli government. There is no real cost. And because of that, successive Israeli governments, and now we have one of the most extreme governments we've had in Israel's history, have been allowed to continue their oppression of the Palestinian people, the land grabbing, often with official blessing, and all the other horrors and instances of repression for 57 years. And it continues, and it continues, and it continues. And Israel continues to disregard resolutions in the Security Council and in the General Assembly and elsewhere. And until the occupation comes with a cost. And by that I don't mean, it can mean individual leaders being locked up. I mean, that's what the ICC case is all about. But until the occupation has a real cost for the settlement economy, if you want to call that, and and for this, basically the settlers who live there, then it will just continue, and the annexation will continue, and very soon we will have any talk of even a two-state solution will just be something we look back as a sort of historical discussion. So it's all, if anybody who cares about justice in Israel-Palestine has to do what they can, and I'm talking as an NGO with a fairly political mandate, we have to do what we can to undercut the occupation and ensure that those individuals and governments who continue the occupation realize that, as was the case in South Africa, that you can't continue a certain line of repression and occupation and apartheid without it costing you something. So Smotrich is, him and his colleagues are in the wind now. We have a new president coming back into the United States. They will have carte blanche to do whatever they like unless the rest of the international community stands up and confronts this. And that's why the ICJ ruling is so important, because this gives us a real platform to challenge what is going on. And then, sorry, that was a long answer, Eva. But the other question about the UN database, we have more companies in our report than the UN database. Our starting point is the same as the UN database. We look at the list of activities which are listed in the reports from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. There's a number of different listed activities, but we argue that the way the High Commissioner's staff have interpreted their mandate is too narrow, which is why some companies, such as Heidelberg Materials, who've been exploiting Palestinian natural resources for 2 decades, are not in the UN database. That's something that many of us have trouble understanding. And there are other companies there which we believe should be in the database. To be fair to the High Commissioner, they were supposed to come with an update of the database a while back, and that's been delayed. So maybe we'll see some of these companies in the new updated database. But we have, as I said, we have a slightly different approach, and we believe, as I said, the bar is maybe set too high for the database. That's why there's a discrepancy.
Your question, I'm not sure if we're in the position to, but Tara, if you...
I'll just add a few things. First, Andrew's right, the OHCHR database is not quite fit for purpose yet. That's unfortunate, but it's a reality of the political nature of the UN. And so use the database for what it gives you, but don't pretend or don't deceive yourself into believing that the database gives you all the answers. It simply doesn't, and it's not designed to. With Smoltrich's comments, he has declared an intention to commit further war crimes, and he has declared an intention to breach the UN Charter and what we call use cogent norms, meaning these norms for which there can be no legal justification for deviating. That should be treated with the severity with which those declarations are. If I were to tell you I'm planning on murdering you tomorrow, or I'm planning on committing a crime, you would have a moral obligation, and in some places a legal obligation, to take that forward, depending on what our relationship is. Why would that not apply in this context? Why would states sit there and listen to such a declaration and then say, it's really complicated? It's not complicated. You just had somebody declare that they want to commit war crimes and grave breaches of the UN Charter. Treat it as such. When it comes to the ESG ratings, we have seen appallingly bad behavior by ESG providers and data providers. Companies that wish to say, maybe there's a conflict in some place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do anything about it. It can't possibly mean that businesses are at risk of being engaged or committing human rights violations in that conflict. How could we possibly know? Well, first of all, it's your job to know. And if you're incapable of figuring out whether or not there's a conflict-affected area in a place like Israel and Palestine, I'm sorry, but you're completely incapable of doing your job and you should close up shop. Because the rest of us can make that declaration, and the international community would have told you a very long time ago, international legal community would have told you a very long time ago that Israel and Palestine is an inherently risky place to do business, and that there is a need to divest from the settlements. Those companies are breaching their own independent responsibility to respect human rights, but more than that, they're putting all other institutional investors at risk of breaching their responsibility. So those companies incur responsibility to provide remedies, but they are also causing institutional investors to incur responsibility. And that's tragic, and I hope the institutional investors start taking that seriously and maybe start using that as an impetus for some strategic lawsuits.
Jens?
Let me just add to Tara's points there. So this is for exactly what Tara just said. This is why we do our own due diligence. We don't rely on the ESG data providers 100% for what we do. They can be useful for what we call product criteria if we want to make sure that we divest from companies involved in controversial weapons or coal, etc. But when it comes to behavior-related exclusions, what they actually do in practice, even if they don't sell controversial weapons, we do our own due diligence. And there's numerous examples of companies who are not flagged by the data providers, but we know that there's questionable behavior and there's reason for us to divest. So I just want to, without going into too long of a rant there, because obviously we use them for certain things and they are useful, but when it comes to behavior-related criteria for divestments and active ownership, you need to do your own due diligence, and that's super important for us. And I know there was one other question as well, and I just wanted to make sure that it was about whether or not we could also make sure that we funnel investment towards, So for us, that's a little bit complicated because we're a passive index investor. So we invest in over 7,000 companies. So the main way that we engage with companies is the other way, where we look at the companies that we invest in through the indexes that we try to track. And then we try to make sure that they change their behavior, and if they do not, that we pull out of them. So that's a little bit different. If you were speaking to a purely active investor who went the other way, that would be a little bit different. But for us, that's not how we invest, basically. So sorry, that's probably not the answer you wanted, but yeah.
Do you invest in armaments?
Sorry?
Do you invest in armaments?
So our policy is to exclude controversial weapons. We don't invest in that. And that includes nuclear bombs, for instance. That's not something we invest in. When it comes to conventional weapons, that's not something that we exclude point blank, but that's just what I was talking about earlier, that it depends. If you have a company that's selling into a conflict zone, obviously that's problematic, and that's where we need to, where we need to engage.
It's now 2:30, which is the official end time of this event. I also want to respect everyone's time, and especially also the time of the panel speakers. But if you are open for it, we can take a last burning question. I see someone in the back,
Hello, I'm Romel Shamsuddin from Center for Human Rights Research and Advocacy in Kuala Lumpur. In July this year, we recently had a conference on the sanctity and value of human life in Kuala Lumpur. And there was a declaration on the sanctity of value of human life. In the aspect of Gaza, as Mr. Preston said just now, the Israelis are just killing. It's a killing machine. And there's no cost to the genocide. And we came out with a cost to genocide in the declaration. And we are trying to basically make it costly for future genocide. We hope that because, for example, the Israeli managed to get nearly $80 billion from compensation for the Nazi Germany genocide. So we think that this should be considered in the report or future reporting about this. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think that was a suggestion, right? Yes. Okay. Can we have a question here?
Hi, I'm Tanya Roberts-Davis. I just have a question in terms of the report and whether you had any findings around European development finance institutions and whether you were seeing flows of financing increase over the past years from DFIs. For example, we've seen that the European Investment Bank has been increasing their investments in the settlement or companies involved in the settlement. So we're just wondering if that was also flagged in your report. Thanks.
The simple answer to that is that we haven't looked at the development finance institutions in the report. It's basically banks, pension funds, other specialist asset managers.
Can we have one last question here in the front?
Thank you so much. Gamze Erdem Türkeli from the University of Antwerp. So what do the findings of the report mean for home states of those companies that are investing in the illegality and illegal situation in its whole, especially in light of the ICJ advisory opinion?
Who wants to answer? Tara, maybe?
Yeah, we make, again, I won't go through all of them now, but we make a number of recommendations to states in the report. And in terms of the ICJ ruling from July, it's very clear in the ICJ ruling that states should do what they can to ensure that trade and investments in the occupied Palestinian territory are brought to an end. So that may be, for example, as is happening, we hope, in Ireland, and in Norway we have also an initiative which has just been launched to basically ban all trade with the illegal settlements and all investments in which are basically contributing to the occupation. So that would be one legislative measure that states can do, but otherwise they should try and encourage as much as possible that companies within their own jurisdiction follow the guidance of not just the ICJ but also the international OECD guidelines, UNGPs, all those things we're talking about here at the UN Forum.
Sarah, one last addition and then we'll round it up.
Thank you. Sorry, I promised to be quick. The ICJ decision was not creating new law. So it was revolutionary because of how it was applied to Israel, but all the legal obligations that the ICJ were discussing in its advisory opinion are long-standing obligations, and they have been interpreted in other cases by the ICJ. And what the ICJ has said quite consistently in its jurisprudence, quite consistently over decades, really, of looking at these issues, is that home states do have an obligation to terminate their economic relationships that normalize unlawful actions. And because the occupation is unlawful, the efforts at annexation is unlawful, and the treatment of Palestinians within the West Bank and East Jerusalem is unlawful, European home states have that obligation to take measures to terminate their trade relationships, but also then to investigate, prosecute, and where appropriate, punish their nationals and their corporate nationals or business leaders who have been implicated in unlawful conduct. So that's an ongoing set of obligations that home states within Europe have, and I hope at least some of them will start to take that seriously.
Thank you very much. So I would like to close it off now. Thank you so much to the speakers. I realize there's, well, so much more to discuss, but yeah, we don't have time. The report was published today. You can find it on don'tbuyintooccupation.org. Yeah, and thank you very much for attending.
Yeah. She was never. But she was I think there, she could never. No. She was never there. No.